The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Harrison's training grounds as Private Jake Morrison adjusted his worn combat boots. The leather had seen better days, scuffed and faded from countless missions he couldn't talk about. Around him, dozens of soldiers moved through their daily routines, but Jake kept to himself, just another face in the crowd. That's exactly how he wanted it. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb strode across the parade ground like he owned every grain of sand beneath his polished boots. His uniform was pressed to perfection, medals arranged with mathematical precision across his chest. Webb had earned his position through politics and paperwork, climbing the ranks in comfortable offices while real soldiers bled in foreign lands. Webb's cold eyes swept across the assembled troops, looking for any excuse to demonstrate his authority. When his gaze landed on Jake, standing quietly near the back of the formation, something in the private's calm demeanor irritated him immediately. "You there," Webb barked, pointing directly at Jake. "Step forward." Jake moved with fluid precision, each step controlled and measured. Years of training had made such movements automatic, though he deliberately kept his posture relaxed, almost casual. He stopped exactly 3 feet from Webb and waited. "When I call you forward, you move with purpose, Private," Webb snarled, stepping closer. "This isn't some country club. You look sloppy. Your boots are a disgrace. Your uniform looks like you slept in it." "Yes, sir," Jake replied quietly, his voice carrying no emotion. The response only fueled Webb's anger. He was used to intimidating younger soldiers, watching them tremble under his harsh words. This private showed no fear, no reaction at all. If anything, there was something almost patient in those dark eyes, as if Jake was simply waiting for Webb to finish. "Did you hear me talking to you, soldier?" Webb stepped even closer, his face inches from Jake's. "I said you look like garbage. Maybe you need to spend some time in the dirt to remember what military discipline looks like." "I heard you, sir," Jake said calmly. Webb's jaw tightened. Around them, other soldiers watched nervously, recognizing the dangerous edge in their commanding officer's voice. Webb was known for his temper, for making examples out of soldiers who caught his attention for the wrong reasons. "Drop and give me 50 push-ups," Webb commanded. "Maybe that will teach you some respect." Without hesitation, Jake dropped to the ground and began performing perfect push-ups. His form was flawless, each repetition controlled and steady. As he counted silently, Webb continued his verbal assault. "Faster! You call that military bearing? I've seen civilians with better discipline." Webb paced around Jake's prone form like a predator circling wounded prey. "Where did you serve before this, Private? Desk duty somewhere soft?" Jake continued his push-ups without responding. He had learned long ago that engaging with bullies only made things worse. Let Webb have his show of power. It would pass, and Jake would continue his mission here at Fort Harrison. But Webb wasn't finished. When Jake completed the 50 push-ups and returned to attention, Webb was waiting with another task. "Since you seem to think you're some kind of athlete, let's see how well you handle real military training. Report to the obstacle course at 0600 tomorrow. Full combat gear. We'll see if you can back up that attitude with performance." "Yes, sir," Jake acknowledged. Webb turned to address the rest of the formation, satisfied that he had established dominance over the quiet private. But as he spoke about military standards and discipline, he missed the brief glances exchanged between several older sergeants who had been watching the confrontation. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran with multiple combat deployments, caught Sergeant Barnes's eye and shook his head slightly. Both men had noticed something Webb had not. The way Jake moved, the controlled breathing during the push-ups, the complete lack of stress in his posture despite the public humiliation. These were not the reactions of an ordinary private. After the formation dismissed, Rodriguez approached Barnes near the motor pool. "You see that?" Rodriguez asked quietly, nodding toward Jake, who was walking away alone. I saw it, Barnes replied, keeping his voice low. That private isn't what he seems to be. No kidding. The way he handled Webb's tantrum. Most soldiers would have been sweating bullets. This guy looked like he was waiting for a bus. Barnes nodded thoughtfully. I've seen that kind of calm before. Usually in guys who've been through things most of us can't imagine. You think Webb has any idea what he's messing with? Webb doesn't have a clue, Rodriguez said. He sees a quiet private and thinks he's found an easy target. But mark my words, this is going to end badly for him. Meanwhile, Jake had returned to his barracks, a simple room he shared with 3 other soldiers. His bunkmates were good men, younger troops who treated him with the easy friendship of soldiers sharing hardship. They had no idea of Jake's background, and he preferred it that way. Rough day with Webb? Asked Private Tommy Chen, a 20-year-old from California who was always quick with a joke. Nothing unusual, Jake replied, beginning to clean his already spotless rifle. The weapon was standard military issue, but Jake maintained it with the obsessive care of someone who understood that his life might depend on its reliability. Man, I don't know how you stay so cool, said Private Davis from the next bunk. If Webb got in my face like that, I'd probably say something stupid and end up in the brig. Jake smiled slightly. Sometimes the best response is no response at all. Easy for you to say, Chen laughed. You're like a robot. Nothing seems to bother you. If only they knew, Jake thought. There had been a time when staying calm under pressure was a matter of survival, when showing fear or anger could mean death not just for himself, but for the men counting on him. Those days felt like a lifetime ago, but the habits remained. That evening, Jake sat alone in the mess hall, eating his dinner in comfortable silence. Around him, conversations flowed about weekend plans, girlfriends back home, and complaints about various officers. He listened with half an ear, finding the normalcy of military life both refreshing and strange after years of operations where conversation was a luxury that could get you killed. Lieutenant Colonel Webb entered the mess hall with his usual swagger, surrounded by junior officers who hung on his every word. As he passed Jake's table, Webb made sure his voice carried. Some soldiers think they can coast through their service without really committing to excellence, Webb said loudly. Tomorrow morning will separate the real soldiers from the pretenders. Jake continued eating without looking up, but several nearby soldiers shifted uncomfortably. Webb's targeting of Jake had become obvious to everyone, and it made the enlisted men nervous. Officers who needed to prove their authority through bullying were dangerous for everyone under their command. After dinner, Jake walked the perimeter of the base alone, a habit he had developed during his first week at Fort Harrison. The evening air was cool, and the sounds of the base settling in for the night were familiar and comforting. Guard posts checked in over radio, vehicles returned from training exercises, and the controlled chaos of military life gradually quieted. Near the eastern fence line, Jake encountered Captain Sarah Mitchell, one of the few officers on base who seemed more interested in her soldiers' welfare than her own advancement. She was reviewing something on her tablet, probably preparation for the next day's training schedule. "Evening, Captain," Jake said with appropriate military courtesy. "Evening, Private Morrison. How are you settling in?" "No complaints, ma'am." Captain Mitchell studied him for a moment. Unlike Webb, she had actually read Jake's service record when he was assigned to her company. What she found there was unusual. Long gaps with no explanation, deployments to locations that weren't officially acknowledged, and commendations that were classified beyond her clearance level. "I heard about your run-in with Lieutenant Colonel Webb today," she said carefully. "Just military training, ma'am. Nothing I can't handle." "I'm sure you can handle it, Private. That's not what concerns me." She paused, choosing her words carefully. Sometimes, officers in positions like Webb's feel the need to establish dominance. It's not always about the individual soldier. Jake understood perfectly. Webb was marking territory, showing the entire unit that he was in charge and willing to make examples of anyone who didn't show proper deference. It was a common enough pattern among insecure leaders. "I appreciate your concern, Captain. I'll do my best to stay out of trouble." Mitchell nodded, but something in Jake's tone suggested he wasn't particularly worried about the obstacle course challenge. Most soldiers facing Webb's particular brand of harassment would be nervous, perhaps angry. Jake sounded like he was discussing the weather. That night, Jake prepared for the next day's challenge with the same methodical approach he brought to everything. His gear was arranged with military precision, weapons cleaned and ready, equipment checked and rechecked. But unlike most soldiers preparing for a difficult day, Jake wasn't focused on surviving Webb's harassment. He was focused on staying invisible. The obstacle course at Fort Harrison was designed to test every aspect of a soldier's physical and mental capabilities. Climbing walls, rope traversals, crawl spaces, and combat scenarios that pushed even experienced troops to their limits. Under normal circumstances, it was challenging but manageable for a fit soldier. Webb had made it clear that Jake's run would not be under normal circumstances. As Jake lay in his bunk that night, listening to the quiet breathing of his sleeping bunkmates, he reflected on the path that had brought him to this moment. 3 months ago, he had been operating in conditions where a single mistake could have started an international incident. Now he was dealing with a petty officer's power games at a routine training base. The irony wasn't lost on him. But Jake had learned patience in schools that didn't appear in any military manual. Tomorrow, he would give Webb exactly what the man expected to see: a competent but unremarkable private doing his best to meet military standards. What Webb didn't realize was that Jake's definition of his best was calibrated to standards that would make Fort Harrison's obstacle course look like a children's playground. In the darkness of his quarters, Jake smiled slightly. Tomorrow would be interesting, but not for the reasons Webb imagined. The real challenge wouldn't be completing the course. It would be making sure he didn't complete it too well. After all, the best way to remain invisible was to be exactly as ordinary as everyone expected you to be, even if ordinary, for Jake Morrison, required more acting ability than most soldiers possessed. Dawn would bring its own challenges, but Jake had faced worse with far more at stake. Lieutenant Colonel Webb was about to learn that some battles weren't worth starting, but by then it would be too late to change course. The die was cast, and Jake Morrison was exactly where he needed to be, hiding in plain sight while Webb prepared to make the biggest mistake of his military career. The alarm sounded at 05:30, but Jake had been awake for 20 minutes, lying quietly in his bunk while his mind ran through the day ahead. Old habits died hard, and years of operations where the difference between success and failure was measured in seconds had trained him to wake naturally before any external signal. Around him, his bunkmates stirred reluctantly. Chen groaned and buried his head under his pillow, while Davis muttered complaints about early mornings. Jake dressed quickly and efficiently, his movements automatic and silent. "You nervous about today?" Chen asked, finally sitting up and rubbing his eyes. "Should I be?" Jake replied, lacing his boots with practiced precision. "Webb's got it out for you, man. Everyone knows it. He's probably going to make that obstacle course hell." Jake shrugged. "It's just training." What he didn't say was that he had run obstacle courses in mountain ranges where the temperature never rose above freezing, in deserts where the heat could kill an unprotected man in hours, and in jungles where every shadow might hide an enemy sniper. Fort Harrison's course, challenging as it was, held no mysteries for him. The bigger challenge would be gauging exactly how well to perform. Too poor, and he might face additional harassment that could draw unwanted attention. Too well, and people might start asking questions about where he learned to move like that. Jake arrived at the obstacle course precisely at 600, his gear clean and properly arranged. Several other soldiers were already present, some participating in the day's training, others clearly there to watch Webb's promised demonstration. Word had spread quickly through the enlisted ranks that their commanding officer was making an example of the quiet private. Lieutenant Colonel Webb stood near the starting line like a general preparing for battle, his uniform immaculate despite the early hour. Behind him, Captain Mitchell watched with obvious concern, while Sergeants Rodriguez and Barnes exchanged knowing looks. "Well, well," Webb announced as Jake approached. "Our star recruit has arrived. I hope you brought your appetite for humble pie, Private, because you're about to learn what real military training looks like." "Yes, sir," Jake responded evenly. Webb gestured grandly toward the obstacle course. "This isn't going to be your standard qualification run. You'll be carrying full combat load, 60 pounds of gear. You'll complete the course twice, consecutively, with no rest between runs. And just to make sure you understand the importance of following orders without question, you'll do it while I provide motivation from close range." The assembled soldiers shifted uncomfortably. What Webb was describing was beyond the normal parameters for obstacle course training. It was designed to break Jake down, both physically and mentally. "Any questions, Private?" Webb asked with obvious satisfaction. "No, sir." Jake began strapping on the additional gear Webb had specified. 60 pounds was substantial, but he had operated with much heavier loads in terrain that made Fort Harrison's manicured course look like a park. As he adjusted the weight distribution, his mind automatically calculated how the extra mass would affect his movement through each obstacle. The course itself was standard military design: a 12-foot climbing wall, rope traverse over a mud pit, low crawl through wire obstacles, tire run, and a final sprint to the finish line. Under normal circumstances, a fit soldier could complete it in 12 to 15 minutes. With the extra weight and back-to-back runs, Webb was expecting Jake to struggle significantly. "Whenever you're ready, Private," Webb called out. "Let's see what you're really made of." Jake moved to the starting line, taking a moment to center himself. Around him, he could sense the attention of everyone present. Some were hoping to see Webb's arrogance backfire. Others were simply curious to see how the quiet private would handle the pressure. What none of them realized was that Jake Morrison had learned patience and precision in situations where the wrong move could have international consequences. This was just another day at the office. He began running. The first obstacle was the climbing wall, 12 feet of vertical wood that required upper body strength and technique to scale quickly. Jake approached it at a steady pace, neither rushing nor hesitating. He scaled the wall with efficient movements, each hand and foot placement precise and economical. No wasted motion, no dramatic effort. To the watching soldiers, it looked like competent but unremarkable performance. Jake had calibrated his movements perfectly to appear skilled without being exceptional. "Is that the best you can do?" Webb shouted, staying close to the course. "My grandmother could climb faster than that." Jake continued to the rope traverse without acknowledging the harassment. The rope stretched 30 feet across a muddy pit, requiring soldiers to cross hand over hand while their gear tried to drag them down into the muck below. It was here that many soldiers struggled, their grip strength failing as the weight of their equipment multiplied the difficulty. Jake crossed the rope with steady rhythm, his breathing controlled and even. Years of similar exercises under much more demanding conditions had given him reserves that the extra weight barely touched, but he made sure to pause occasionally, letting his arms shake slightly, as if the effort was taking its toll. "Look at him struggle," Webb called out to the spectators. "This is what happens when soldiers think they can coast through their service. Real military training separates the men from the boys." The low crawl came next, a 50-yard stretch under barbed wire barriers that forced soldiers to drag themselves through dirt and mud using only their elbows and knees. It was designed to be miserable, testing mental toughness as much as physical endurance. Jake dropped to his stomach and began the crawl, keeping his profile low and his movements smooth. The wire caught at his uniform and gear, but he navigated the obstacle with the patience of someone who had crawled through much worse. Behind him, Webb continued his commentary. "Faster, Private! The enemy isn't going to wait for you to figure out how to move properly." As Jake emerged from the wire obstacles and moved toward the tire run, he noticed General Patricia Harris approaching the training area with her aide. Harris was the base commander, a no-nonsense officer with 30 years of service and a reputation for fairness that extended throughout the entire military. Her arrival was unexpected, and Jake saw several officers straightening their postures unconsciously. The tire run consisted of 20 truck tires laid out in a pattern that required soldiers to step quickly and precisely through the sequence without tripping. With 60 pounds of gear and the fatigue from previous obstacles, it was where many soldiers lost their rhythm and stumbled. Jake maintained his steady pace through the tires, his feet finding each opening with mechanical precision. To anyone watching, it looked like solid military competency, good enough to pass, but nothing that would draw special attention. General Harris had stopped to watch the training exercise, her experienced eyes taking in the scene. She noticed Webb's aggressive posturing immediately, recognizing the signs of an officer using his position to bully subordinates, but her attention was drawn more to the soldier completing the course. There was something about Jake's movement that caught her attention. She had seen thousands of soldiers over 3 decades of service, and she recognized the difference between trained competence and something more. This private moved with the kind of controlled precision that usually came from specialized training or extensive combat experience. "Who is that soldier?" she asked Captain Mitchell quietly. "Private Morrison, ma'am. He's been assigned to Lieutenant Colonel Webb's unit for about 6 weeks. What's his background?" Mitchell hesitated. "His service record is somewhat unusual, General. Large portions are classified beyond my clearance level." Harris's interest sharpened. Classified service records were not common for enlisted personnel unless they had been involved in special operations or sensitive assignments. She watched more carefully as Jake approached the final sprint portion of the course. Webb had positioned himself near the finish line, clearly planning to maximize his harassment during Jake's most vulnerable moment. The run from the tire course to the finish was 200 yards of open ground, traditionally completed at maximum sprint despite accumulated fatigue. "Come on, Private!" Webb shouted. "Show me that military bearing you're so famous for. My 6-year-old daughter could run faster than that." Jake accelerated to a steady run, controlling his breathing and maintaining form despite the weight and accumulated exertion. He crossed the finish line with time to spare and immediately turned back toward the starting point for his second run. "No rest, Private," Webb called out unnecessarily. "Real soldiers don't get breaks in combat." As Jake began his second traverse of the course, General Harris moved closer to observe. Something was nagging at her about this situation, beyond just Webb's obvious bullying. There was a quality to Jake's performance that suggested reserves he wasn't revealing. The second run proceeded much like the first. Jake maintained his steady, competent pace through each obstacle, while Webb continued his verbal assault. But Harris noticed that despite completing nearly 30 minutes of intense physical activity with substantial added weight, Jake's breathing remained controlled and his movements showed no signs of real fatigue. During the second rope traverse, a gust of wind caught Jake's shirt, pulling it tight against his body. For just a moment, General Harris caught sight of something that made her step closer for a better look. There was a small patch visible beneath Jake's standard military clothing, barely noticeable unless someone knew what to look for. Harris squinted, trying to get a clearer view as Jake continued across the rope. When he reached the other side and began the second low crawl, the patch disappeared again beneath his gear and clothing. But Harris had seen enough to recognize what she thought it might be. Her expression grew very serious as the implications began to register. If she was right about what she had seen, Lieutenant Colonel Webb was making a very serious mistake, the kind of mistake that could end a career and create international incidents if it went too far. Jake completed his second run through the course with the same steady competence he had shown throughout. As he crossed the finish line for the final time, Webb was waiting with obvious disappointment. The private had completed the challenge successfully, denying Webb the public humiliation he had been hoping to deliver. "Adequate, I suppose," Webb said grudgingly. "Though barely meeting minimum military standards. Perhaps next time you'll approach training with more enthusiasm." "Yes, sir," Jake replied, his breathing only slightly elevated despite the extreme exertion. As the assembled soldiers began to disperse, General Harris approached the group. Her presence immediately commanded attention, with everyone snapping to appropriate military bearing. "Lieutenant Colonel Webb," she said formally, "an impressive training exercise. May I speak with you privately?" Webb's face lit up with what he assumed was recognition of his leadership. "Of course, General. I was just demonstrating proper military discipline to—" "Privately, Lieutenant Colonel," Harris interrupted, her tone carrying unmistakable authority. As Webb followed the general toward the base headquarters building, Harris caught Captain Mitchell's eye and nodded toward Jake, who was removing his additional gear near the equipment shed. "Captain, please ask Private Morrison to report to my office in 1 hour. Full dress uniform." Mitchell's eyes widened slightly. Being summoned to the base commander's office was rarely a routine matter for enlisted personnel. "Yes, ma'am. May I ask—" "1 hour, Captain." As General Harris walked away with Lieutenant Colonel Webb trailing behind her like a confused puppy, the atmosphere around the obstacle course grew tense. Sergeants Rodriguez and Barnes approached Jake as he finished cleaning his equipment. "Everything okay, Morrison?" Rodriguez asked quietly. "Far as I know, Sergeant." "The general wants to see you," Barnes added. "That's either very good or very bad. Usually not much in between." Jake nodded thoughtfully. He had hoped to maintain his low profile for at least a few more months before his assignment here was complete. But if General Harris had noticed something during the training exercise, that timeline might have just accelerated significantly. The question was whether she had recognized what she was looking at, or simply noticed that something didn't add up about the quiet private who could complete a punishing obstacle course without breaking a sweat. Either way, Jake Morrison's carefully constructed anonymity might be about to come to an end, and that could complicate everything about his mission at Fort Harrison. General Patricia Harris sat behind her desk, reviewing a classified file that had required 3 different authorization codes to access. The information contained within confirmed what she had suspected when she caught that brief glimpse of the patch beneath Private Morrison's uniform during the obstacle course demonstration. The knock on her office door came precisely 1 hour after she had requested it. Military punctuality was something she appreciated, especially when dealing with situations that required delicate handling. "Enter," she called out. Jake Morrison stepped into the office in full dress uniform, every detail perfect. His bearing was military correct but relaxed, showing none of the nervousness most enlisted personnel displayed when summoned to the base commander's office. Harris noticed immediately that he moved with the controlled precision she had observed during the training exercise. "Private Morrison reporting as requested, ma'am." "At ease, Private. Please have a seat." Jake settled into the chair across from her desk, maintaining alert posture while appearing comfortable in the formal setting. Harris studied him for a moment, comparing the man in front of her with the information in the classified file. "Private Morrison, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I expect a direct answer. What is your real reason for being assigned to Fort Harrison?" The question hung in the air between them. Jake's expression didn't change, but Harris caught the slight pause that suggested he was calculating exactly how much truth to reveal. "I'm here for advanced training in logistics coordination, ma'am. Standard assignment rotation." Harris smiled slightly. It was the answer any reasonable soldier would give, and technically it wasn't even a lie. The logistics coordination training was part of his cover assignment, but they both knew it wasn't the complete truth. "Private Morrison," she said, opening the classified file and placing it where he could see the cover page. "We both know that's not the whole story." Jake's eyes flicked to the file, and for the first time since entering the office, his carefully controlled expression shifted slightly. The classification markings on that folder were beyond what most generals had access to, let alone base commanders at routine training facilities. "I see you recognize the security clearance required for this information," Harris continued. "What you may not know is that I spent the first 15 years of my career in military intelligence. I know what special operations personnel look like, even when they're pretending to be ordinary soldiers." Jake remained silent, but his posture had shifted almost imperceptibly. Harris recognized it as the subtle change that happened when a covert operative realized their cover might be compromised. "During this morning's training exercise, I caught sight of something that made me very curious. A small patch, partially visible beneath your uniform. Most people wouldn't have recognized it, but I spent 3 years as liaison to Joint Special Operations Command." She leaned forward slightly. "That patch belongs to Task Force Black, doesn't it? The unit that officially doesn't exist and handles operations that never appeared in any mission reports." Jake met her gaze steadily. "I'm not authorized to discuss classified operations, ma'am. I'm not asking you to discuss operations, Private. I'm asking you to confirm what we both already know so I can address a serious problem that's developing with Lieutenant Colonel Webb." The mention of Webb's name caused Jake's eyes to narrow slightly. Harris caught the reaction and pressed her advantage. "Webb has been harassing you for weeks because he thinks you're an easy target, a quiet private who won't fight back. He has no idea that he's been bullying one of the most lethal soldiers in the United States military." Jake remained silent, but Harris could see the internal calculation happening behind his eyes. Finally, he spoke. "What exactly do you want to know, General?" "I want to know if you're here on an official assignment that I should be aware of, or if this is personal cover for recovery from a classified mission. Because if Webb's harassment interferes with official business, that's a matter of national security. And if he's targeting a decorated special operations veteran who's trying to decompress from classified service, that's a different kind of problem that needs to be addressed immediately." Jake considered his options. His assignment to Fort Harrison was supposed to be simple. 6 months of routine duty while his last mission was debriefed and analyzed, and while the intelligence community decided where to send him next. The cover story of a regular soldier needing logistics training had been designed to be boring enough that no one would look too closely. But Webb's harassment was creating exactly the kind of attention Jake had been sent here to avoid. "I'm on authorized recovery assignment, ma'am. Transitional duty pending next deployment." Harris nodded. It was what she had expected. "How long since your last operational deployment?" 3 months, ma'am." "Where?" Jake hesitated. Even with General Harris's security clearance, some information was compartmentalized beyond her need to know. "That's classified above my authorization to discuss." "Ma'am." "I understand." Harris closed the classified file and sat back in her chair. "Private Morrison, what Lieutenant Colonel Webb did this morning was unacceptable under any circumstances. But given your actual status, it was dangerously inappropriate. I'm going to address this situation immediately." Before Jake could respond, there was another knock on the office door. Harris checked her schedule and nodded grimly. "Enter." Lieutenant Colonel Webb strode into the office with his characteristic swagger, clearly expecting to discuss his successful demonstration of military discipline. His confidence faltered slightly when he saw Jake sitting across from the general's desk. "General Harris, I hope Private Morrison hasn't been complaining about standard military training. Some soldiers need firm guidance to reach their potential." Harris gestured to a chair. Sit down, Lieutenant Colonel. Webb settled into his seat, shooting a sideways glance at Jake that promised future retaliation for whatever conversation had taken place in his absence. Lieutenant Colonel Webb, Harris began, her voice carrying the formal tone that experienced officers recognized as a warning. I want you to look very carefully at Private Morrison and tell me what you see. Webb looked confused but complied. I see a private who needs to learn proper military bearing and respect for authority, ma'am. Look again. Look at how he sits, how he holds himself, how he moves. Use the experience you gained during your deployments to Afghanistan. Webb studied Jake more carefully, his expression growing uncertain. There was something about the private that he had missed during his weeks of harassment, a quality of stillness that suggested capability rather than passivity. I'm not sure what you want me to see, General. Harris opened her desk drawer and withdrew a small object, a military patch with distinctive markings that Webb recognized immediately. His face went pale as the implications registered. This is a Task Force Black operational patch, Lieutenant Colonel. Are you familiar with that unit? Webb's mouth went dry. Task Force Black was legendary within special operations communities, the unit that handled missions too sensitive for official acknowledgement. Their members were recruited from the most elite soldiers in all branches of the military, and their identities were protected at the highest levels of government. Yes, ma'am. I'm familiar with their reputation. Good. Now I want you to look at Private Morrison again and understand that you have been harassing one of the most highly trained and experienced special operations soldiers in our military, a man who has completed missions that are classified beyond your security clearance. The color drained completely from Webb's face as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. He turned to stare at Jake, seeing for the first time what General Harris had recognized immediately. The controlled movements, the complete lack of intimidation, the way he had completed the obstacle course challenge without apparent effort. Sir, Webb began, but Harris cut him off. Private Morrison is here on transitional assignment, recovering from classified operational deployment. Instead of allowing him the quiet service he was sent here for, you have spent weeks creating exactly the kind of attention and disruption that his assignment was designed to avoid. Jake remained silent throughout the exchange, watching Webb's growing realization with detached interest. He had encountered officers like Webb throughout his career, men who confused rank with competence, authority with leadership. Furthermore, Harris continued, your harassment of Private Morrison has been observed by enlisted personnel throughout this base. Your behavior has undermined morale and created an environment where soldiers question the judgment and fairness of their commanding officers. Webb found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. General, I had no idea of his background. His service record shows exactly what it was designed to show, Lieutenant Colonel. The fact that you didn't recognize what you were dealing with demonstrates a serious lack of situational awareness that calls your fitness for command into question. Harris stood, and both men rose automatically to attention. Lieutenant Colonel Webb, you are hereby relieved of command pending a full investigation into your leadership practices. You will report to the base adjutant for reassignment to administrative duties, effective immediately. Webb's career was ending, and everyone in the room knew it. Officers who harassed special operations personnel, especially those on classified assignments, did not recover from such mistakes. The investigation Harris had mentioned would be a formality before his discharge from military service. Private Morrison, Harris said, turning her attention to Jake. I apologize on behalf of the United States Army for the treatment you have received here. Is there anything you need to complete your assignment successfully? Jake stood at attention, but his voice carried no emotion when he responded. No, ma'am. I appreciate your intervention, but the situation was manageable. Harris almost smiled. Even after being publicly vindicated, Jake was maintaining his operational mindset. No unnecessary drama, no personal satisfaction in Webb's downfall. Just professional acknowledgement that a problem had been resolved. Very well. You're dismissed, Private Morrison. Enjoy the rest of your stay at Fort Harrison. As Jake left the office, Webb remained standing at attention, his world collapsing around him. Harris waited until the door closed before addressing him again. Lieutenant Colonel, in my 30 years of military service, I have never seen an officer make such a catastrophic error in judgment. You had one of our most elite warriors under your command, and instead of recognizing his value, you tried to break him down through petty harassment. Webb could only nod numbly. Private Morrison completed missions that saved American lives and protected national security while you were pushing papers in comfortable offices. His service record may be classified, but his value to this country is beyond question. And you treated him like a raw recruit who needed to be taught lessons about military discipline. Harris moved to the window overlooking the training grounds where the morning's events had unfolded. Do you know what the most tragic part of this situation is, Lieutenant Colonel? Private Morrison never once complained, never used his real authority to stop your harassment, never pulled rank or revealed his identity to make you look foolish. He simply endured your behavior because maintaining his cover was more important to him than his personal dignity. She turned back to face Webb. That level of professionalism and dedication to mission success is what real military leadership looks like. You might have learned something from him if you had been smart enough to recognize what you were seeing. An hour later, Jake sat in the base mess hall, eating lunch alone as usual. Word of Webb's sudden removal had spread quickly through the base, but most soldiers didn't understand the connection to the morning's training exercise. They saw only that an unpopular officer had been relieved of command, which was cause for quiet celebration among the enlisted ranks. Sergeant Rodriguez approached Jake's table with obvious curiosity. "Mind if I sit down, Morrison?" Jake gestured to an empty chair. "Free country, Sergeant." "So Webb's gone, just like that, after what happened this morning." Rodriguez studied Jake's face, looking for any sign of satisfaction or relief. "Word is he got called to the general's office right after you did." "I wouldn't know anything about that, Sergeant." Rodriguez nodded slowly. "Course not." "None of my business anyway." He paused. "But I got to ask. There's something different about you, isn't there? Something we're not supposed to know about." Jake met the sergeant's gaze steadily. "I'm just a private doing his job, Sergeant. Same as anyone else." "Right," Rodriguez grinned. "Same as anyone else. Got it." As Rodriguez walked away, Jake returned to his lunch and his thoughts. In 2 months, his assignment at Fort Harrison would be complete, and he would receive orders for his next deployment. There would be new missions, new challenges, new situations where his specialized skills would be needed. But for now, he was exactly where he was supposed to be, a quiet, private, completing routine training while the world continued its complicated dance around him. Webb's harassment had been an irritation, but not a serious problem. Men like Webb came and went, but the mission always continued. Jake finished his lunch and prepared to return to the afternoon's training schedule. Tomorrow there would be new exercises, new challenges, new opportunities to remain invisible while maintaining the skills that made him one of the most effective soldiers in the world. Outside the mess hall, life at Fort Harrison continued its normal rhythm. But now it would continue without Lieutenant Colonel Webb's particular brand of leadership, and Jake Morrison could complete his assignment in the peace and anonymity he had been sent there to find. Sometimes the best missions were the ones where nothing appeared to happen at all.